Here we see the medal by Denon, commemorating Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Montenotte in 1796. On the obverse we see the handsome head by Raymond Gerard of the young General Napoleone Bonaparte. Though he's only 26 years old, he's looking calmly into the distance with a confident, penetrating, imperturbable gaze, his long, impeccably combed hair falling in gentle waves over his high collar, elegantly embroidered with oak leaves. On the reverse, from a design by Louis Laffitte, but engraved by Romain Vincent Geoffroy, winged Victory flies over the earth, wielding her sword, but bringing peace in the form of a palm frond along with wreaths for the victors. Her right foot propels her aloft, as if she were springing into the air from the redoubt of Monteneggino, the defence of which turned out to be the linchpin of Napoleon's victory at Montenotte. She flies out over the Italian peninsula and the southern and eastern Mediterranean beyond, presaging Napoleon's coming conquests, including Egypt in the distance, even while the seas below are teeming with ships, perhaps to represent the enemy British fleets. It's a curious fact that the Battle of Montenotte, Napoleon's first true victory as a commanding general, was not commemorated in a medal by Dominique Vivant-Denon, Napoleon's Master of the Mint, until 1813, despite the battle being fought in 1796. This seems a rather strange oversight for a man like Denon, with his keen and discerning mind, who was ever vigilant for opportunities to shine the lustre of Napoleon's career and to propagate the myth of his invincible genius. Why? After all, our main purpose for the Napoleonic series of commemorative medals orchestrated by Denon was to use art to propagandize Napoleon's glory, and by this backdoor route to subtly and surreptitiously and subconsciously influence the minds of Europeans, simultaneously buttressing the resolve of Frenchmen to support their emperor's vision of conquest, and to weaken the resolve of all who stood in Napoleon's way. Surely, a celebration of the infant general's earliest strategic brilliance at Montenotte in 1796 would help to indelibly stamp in the European mind the impression that Napoleon's career really was God-given, or at least governed by his star of fortune, and therefore inevitable, just as Napoleon himself had come to believe. Why such a medal did not appear prior to 1803 or 1804 is easy to say. Denon was only appointed Master of the Mint and Director of Napoleon's museums after those dates, and perhaps, given the flood of Napoleon's victories after that time and their increasing magnitude and significance to the course of European history, Denon had more than enough on his plate. There were so many victories and heroic feats and conquests and brilliant acts of treaty-making and governance by Napoleon to propagandize on a medal that Denon had an embarrassment of riches to choose from, and so perhaps it was that the overwhelming tide of history simply came to dwarf the little victory at Montenotte all those years before, in 1796. But why then did the medal finally appear in 1813? That question is what we've come to answer. But first, let's explore and understand the significance of Napoleon's victory at Montenotte and why it deserved a place in Denon's Napoleonic series of medals. Prior to the Montenotte campaign in March 1796, the young general, fresh from his honeymoon with his new bride Josephine, addressed his troops in the following terms: "Soldiers, you are half-starved and half-naked. The government owes you much, but can do nothing for you. Your patience and courage are honourable to you, but they procure you neither advantage nor glory. I am about to lead you into the most fertile valleys of the world. There you will find flourishing cities and teeming provinces. There you will reap honour, glory, and riches. Soldiers of the army of Italy, will you lack courage?" But Napoleon, always the realist, knew, even at this tender age, that stirring words were only empty promises unless backed by action, and so the rather bedraggled-looking youth who dared to address his battle-hardened but defeated, disappointed and cynical army, immediately set out to address their needs. They were starving, he fed them. They were naked, he clothed them. The government had stolen their wages, he paid them. They were poorly supplied, he equipped them, all by personally raising funds through a local banker. His men found kindness and indulgence on the one hand, tempered by a stern, implacable resolve on the other. Immediately on taking command at Nice, he had one mutinous battalion disbanded. Napoleon also immediately left a deep impression on his officers. General Massena admired his boundless energy, his vigour, and his incisive commands, while the formidable General Augereau seemed to shrink in stature beneath the intellectual supremacy of Napoleon's gaze, even though Napoleon himself described Augereau as having plenty of character, courage, firmness, activity, is inured to war, is well liked by the soldiery, is fortunate in his operations. All of Napoleon's qualities of leadership at this point seem to have been captured, as if in a snapshot, by Gerard's magnificent head of Napoleon on the Montenotte medal. Confident, penetrating, imperturbable, a young man carefully poised, but ready to leap into furious action at any moment, like a young, resting lion. How did this young man from an obscure Mediterranean island off the coasts of France and Italy so quickly reach the lofty position of commander of the French Republican Army of Italy? There was a strong dose of political acumen about it, undoubted military skill, hard work, ruthlessness, and more than a dash of opportunism. Moments where luck opened a portal for Napoleon to enter, and through which he did not hesitate to rush. But Napoleon was not perfect, despite the image he carefully polished, and he knew from an early period that suppressing information about his failures, or simply lying about them, was an equally essential propaganda tool for a leader as trumpeting his successes. Let's take a brief look at how he got here. In 1793, Napoleon was an artillery captain, just back in Paris from fighting with, then against, the independence leader Paoli in Corsica. He and his whole family had been hounded out of Corsica by Paoli. Finding himself at a loose end, but now fully committed to the revolutionary cause after his Corsican escapade, Napoleon published a pro-republican pamphlet, The Supper at Beaucaire, which brought him to the attention of the brother of the powerful politician Robespierre. With the added support of Robespierre's friend and Napoleon's fellow Corsican, the politician Salicetti, Napoleon was appointed artillery commander at the siege of Toulon, where he distinguished himself by taking the heights that dominated the city, and, by aiming his artillery at the British, forced them to evacuate. One of those portals through which Napoleon so easily slid to grasp his chance had just opened. That he was wounded in the thigh did not hurt his reputation, and he was, astonishingly, promoted brigadier general at age 24 years. His dash and éclat brought him to the immediate attention of the Committee of Public Safety, who put him in charge of the Army of Italy's artillery. There he wasted no time hatching military plans to attack the Kingdom of Sardinia, which was in coalition with France's main enemy after Britain, the Austrian Empire, overlords of a large swathe of northern Italy that did not necessarily want them as their masters. In 1794, the French government approved Napoleon's plan designed to snatch strategic positions away from the Austro-Sardinian army along the Italian Riviera and deep into the Maritime and Ligurian Alps. General Massena, Napoleon's future trusted subordinate at the Battle of Montenotte, successfully executed the plan and was able to seize Ormia and then outflank the enemy at Seorg. This was the foothold in Italy that the French needed, and the starting point from which Napoleon would eventually drive a wedge between the Austrian and Sardinian armies at the Battle of Montenotte, separating them and crushing them, one after the other, in the initial battles of the First Italian Campaign. Capturing portions of this rich agricultural area of northern Italy would serve multiple purposes for the French government. It would help sow the spirit of the Revolution, creating a buffer state separating France, which was still in an incipient and fragile state of republicanism, from that other threatening Ancien Regime, the Austrian Empire. But more urgently, and of more immediate import, it would provide an immediate cash injection to pay the fractious and discontented troops who otherwise might return to France in revolt to overthrow the revolution. But before the success came the disaster. In the Thermidorian reaction of July 1794, the Robespierres fell under the blade of the guillotine, and with them too fell Napoleon's influence in Paris. He was caught up in the political mess and briefly imprisoned. His skills, however, were too good to waste. They were needed in the West, in the Vendée, where counter-revolutionaries were trying to bring down the revolution. But the offer of an infantry, rather than an artillery generalship, insulted Napoleon's honour, and he begged off, citing ill health. He was taken off the active army list and transferred to a desk job at the Bureau of Topography. His finances were in disarray, his future clouded, and at this point he drifted away from reality. Although he was engaged to his brother Joseph's sister-in-law, Désirée Clary, he contemplated suicide, and it was during this period that he poured all of his frustration and longing into writing a romantic novella, Clisson et Eugénie, and unsuccessfully applied to be transferred to exotic Constantinople, where he might fulfill his fantasies of power by joining the Sultan's army. But then, in early October 1795, another portal unexpectedly opened, and through which Napoleon once again so easily slid. Suddenly, everything in Napoleon's life changed, forever. When royalists in Paris declared a rebellion against the convention, Paul Barras, a leader in the Thermidorian reaction, and a politician impressed by Napoleon's success at Toulon and in Italy, appointed him commander of a force to defend the convention, then sitting in the Tuileries Palace. Napoleon instinctively reached out for artillery, and this time ordered a young cavalry officer, later his trusted subordinate and brother-in-law Joachim Murat, to seize some heavy cannon, and on the 5th of October 1795, called in the French Republican calendar used at the time 13 Vendémiaire en 4, from which the disgraceful incident takes its name, Napoleon aimed his cannons directly at the rebellious Parisian crowds, without pity and without delay, and then did not hesitate for a moment to open fire, decimating them and immediately suppressing the uprising. Bullet holes from the incident are still visible in the facade of the church of Saint-Roch on Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris, where some of the rebels tried to shelter. Suddenly, virtually overnight, Napoleon had won fame and wealth, along with the patronage of the relieved new government, the Directory, and of Paul Barras, one of the directors, who was so grateful to Napoleon both for crushing the insurrection and for taking his latest mistress, Josephine de Beauharnais, off his hands and marrying her, that he sent Napoleon off to Nice to take command of the army of Italy. This is where we find Napoleon, on the cusp of the invasion of Liguria and Piedmont, and his victory at Montenotte. An appropriate design for the reverse of the Montenotte medal, the flying winged victory, was ordered by Denon from the talented French artist Louis Laffitte, the artist who drew the elegant female portraits used to represent the seasons in the French revolutionary calendar. Napoleon well knew and appreciated Laffitte's work. His trusted interior designers, Percier and Fontaine, who renovated Napoleon and Josephine's country estate at Malmaison, had engaged Laffitte to paint, among other works, the Pompeian dances in the dining room. In 1810, Laffitte also helped the architect Chalgrin decorate the proposed L'Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile, designed to commemorate the Battle of Austerlitz, but because it was as yet uncompleted, ordered by Napoleon in 1810 to be erected as a temporary wood and plaster mock-up to celebrate Archduchess Marie-Louise's entry into Paris as Napoleon's second wife. Here we see Laffitte's multiple attempts at the design of the Montenotte medal, his artistic cogitations and musings, so to speak, no doubt dashed off quickly, almost automatically, from his fertile imagination. They are now kept in the British Museum along with some of Laffitte's other designs from the Napoleonic series, some of which were engraved and some not. Either Geoffroy, who Denon engaged to engrave the reverse, or more likely the erudite and sophisticated Denon himself, tinkered with Laffitte's sketch and added to it some further intriguing symbolism and allusion to squeeze more meaning from the medal and more propaganda value. For example, after Denon and Geoffroy's extra touches, Victory's sword is now angled slightly forward, not in limp repose or swept behind as in Laffitte's designs. This change enhances the sense that Victory is in forward motion, and it simultaneously intimates that Victory, and therefore Napoleon himself, has not quite yet completed her conquests, as she directs her sword's sharpened point threateningly beyond the horizon of the world below. Likewise, instead of flying over just some nondescript Ligurian littoral scene, as in the Lafitte design, Denon has made Victory soar over the entirety of the Italian peninsula, the Mediterranean, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt beyond, as if these were to be inevitably conquered next. It's all a bit of a fib, really, because although Napoleon was to hold the Italian peninsula in his grip in the years after Montenotte, after losing it for a time again to Austria when he left to conquer Egypt, his attempt to hold Egypt and invade Syria and to meet up with Turkey was thoroughly spoiled by another military genius, Admiral Nelson, and the Royal Navy at the Battle of Aboukir Bay, and by Sir Sidney Smith at the Siege of Acre. As to the artistic quality of the engraving, Geoffroy's work seems surprisingly stiff, and the anatomical modelling rather cartoonish, unlike, say, the exquisitely modelled and executed Victory by Duvivier in his Republican Award Medal of 1798. Duvivier, a truly great artist, here shows us just what can be done with a simple, sharpened burin on a steel surface. Here Victory is a real woman, not a lifelike mannequin, whose billowing robes convincingly envelop her and help to realize her curvaceous body underneath. Duvivier, unlike Geoffroy, has even captured Victory's subtler gestures, her relaxed left arm outstretched, almost letting the palm and the laurel wreath slip into the victor's grasp, her body twisted slightly to the right to raise her trumpet with her softly muscled right arm while she strains to blow it. With her hair freely flowing in the breeze, and the strap of her gown casually fallen from her shoulder, just as any living, breathing woman will have experienced and would recognize. It is a beautifully observed work of art that provides us with a convincing illusion of three-dimensionality, while Geoffroy's is not. Geoffroy's is flat and rigid and irrevocably bound to its two-dimensional surface, and perhaps this is due to Denon not paying Geoffroy enough for the engraving, or demanding he rush the work. However, examination of some of Geoffroy's other medals does seem to betray a somewhat less than perfect grasp of the pliability and the articulation of the human body, and how to use garments to convincingly model the human form. See here the meticulously detailed but rather stiff posture and doll-like modelling, as well as the limp and lifeless garments of both Geoffroy's sitting Napoleon and of the standing city of Paris, represented by a classical female, even though, unlike the 41mm Montenotte medal, this is a larger medal at 68mm, with plenty of field for Geoffroy to work with. No, we must conclude, I'm afraid, that Gerhard's obverse of the Montenotte medal is of a much higher artistic quality than that of Geoffroy's reverse. Perhaps this was due to the fact that Gerhard, a natural sculptor from an early age, had been discovered, so to speak, by the sculptor Boisot, and drawn into his circle of artist friends where he could benefit from their indulgence and their critical attention. Gerhard was his son, Paul Joseph Raymond Gerhard's first teacher, who was later taught by the great David d'Angers, and who became an accomplished 19th century sculptor, much patronised by the elite of French society, winning a second-class medal at the Salon of 1834 and 2 firsts at the Salons of 1846 and 1848. It may be that Lafitte also had a hand in the design of the obverse of the medal, the head of Napoleon engraved by Gerhard, although I have not seen any evidence for this. Leonard Forer, the author of the Biographical Dictionary of Medalists, described Gerhard as a good portraitist, despite being a little old-fashioned for his era, and so, I suppose, he was probably more than capable of designing the profile of Napoleon himself. For example, see Gerhard's well-observed and convincing portraits of the Austrian Emperor and of the King of Prussia on his medals commemorating their visits to the Paris Mint in 1814. On the other hand, Lafitte was in Italy from the early 1790s, having won the Prix de Rome in 1791, and he stayed until 1796, overlapping with Napoleon's first Italian campaign. And Lafitte certainly knew what Napoleon looked like in 1796, according to the historian Philip Dwyer. Bonaparte sat for 5 artists in Italy: Appiani in Milan, Louis Lafitte in Florence, Bacla d'Albe and Gross back in Milan, and Francesco Cossia in Verona. Here is Lafitte's sketch of Napoleon in 1796. Lafitte's Napoleon is a beautiful young man, almost feminine, looking off into the distance as if he were dreaming of his future conquests. While Lafitte's is an almost full-face portrait, its beauty seems to anticipate the attractiveness we see in the obverse profile of the Montenotte medal. However, as the numismatist David Bloch seems to imply, Gerhard may have simply prettied up the more realistic portraits of Napoleon available to him at the time, such as this one by Duvivier on the obverse of an earlier medal engraved at the time of the first Italian campaign. Compare the Montenotte portrait with that of Duvivier's in his impressive 56mm medal of 1797, the Treaty of Campo Formio. The large beak-like nose of Napoleon and his pronounced forehead and chin have been toned down to a more classical, idealized version of male beauty, more like Lafitte's. As a comparison, see here Napoleon's real features from his death mask, taken in St. Helena in 1821. And as we shall see in this series of films, the process of idealizing Napoleon and making him and his actions seem more perfect, more godlike, and therefore infallible and irresistible, was an important part of Denon's purpose in creating the Napoleonic series. This magical process of propaganda was especially needed in 1813 when the Montenotte medal was struck, because the vigorous, brilliant young general who had crushed the Austrian juggernaut at Montenotte in 1796, and who had a whole life and reign and empire ahead of him, was very much needed again. If the young general could not be conjured up in the flesh, then Denon would summon him back to the world in memory, through a medal, to stir the failing heart of a French nation exhausted by war. In 1813, the juggernaut to be checked and overcome was no longer Austria and little Sardinia alone. They were now joined by the implacable British under Wellington, meticulously and indomitably advancing through Spain towards the French border, the pitiless Prussians, commanded by von Blücher, who promised to hang Napoleon from a tree if he captured him, and the furious and vengeful Russian bear, which was about to rampage across Europe on the heels of the humiliated and decimated Grande Armée, which was trudging home from Moscow to France from its ignominious defeat in the Russian campaign of 1812 to 1813. Finally, we now turn to the reason that the Montenotte medal exists at all. Napoleon's stunning victory at the Battle of Montenotte on the 12th of April 1796, the first triumph of his brilliant First Italian campaign. Where did it take place? Deep in the Maritime Alps, just to the north of Savona, on the Italian Riviera. Why was it so stunning? Because Napoleon alone had identified the fundamental weakness of his enemy, and with ruthless efficiency used it against them. What was that weakness? Division. Napoleon had detected physical and political division between the Austrians and the Sardinians, and he had also determined how to use the landscape to maximize that division. If a numerically superior army like the combined forces of the Austrians and Sardinians had remained concentrated against the French in 1796, they could have driven the French down through the mountain passes and into the sea, where the Royal Navy would have picked them off with cannon fire. The Austro-Sardinian army would have won, Napoleon would have lost, and the Montenotte medal would never have been contemplated. But they did not. Napoleon divided the Austrian and Sardinian forces and separately drove both armies towards inevitable defeat. This was Napoleon's first flash of military genius on the battlefield. Oh, he had some luck too. Beaulieu, the Austrian commander, elderly by this time and in his dotage, thought that the initial movement of the French along the coast towards Genoa was an attempt to attack his army through mountain passes north of that city. He was wrong. Napoleon was simply pressuring the Genoese in an attempt to extort money from the government as restitution for allowing a British ship to seize a French merchantman anchored in the supposedly neutral port of Genoa. Actually, Napoleon was initially a bit miffed by Beaulieu's checking action, that is, until he saw how it fitted in with his plans. Once again, a portal had opened for Napoleon, and he had, yet again, effortlessly slid through it to take advantage of the luck it brought him. Napoleon, known to be genuinely superstitious, was eventually to mythologize this preternatural skill of his and to transmute it into a supernatural force, his star of destiny. We shall see in future episodes how Denon incorporated this mythology into the Napoleonic series of medals. But Napoleon's complete acceptance that a supernatural force was guiding him was still a few months away, and it would finally come at the little bridge at Lodi on the 10th of May, 1796, something we shall hear about in a future episode. In preparation for his campaign, Napoleon concentrated his forces near Savona. He had, in total, about 40,000 men, positioned at various points along the Riviera. From Savona, he sent a contingent of troops to push east along the coast as far as Voltri, to threaten Genoa. Their manoeuvres were fortuitously screened from the enemy outposts due to the winter snows still laying heavily upon the ground north of the mountains, even as they thawed on the southern slopes that descended to the Riviera. Although these troops were simply aimed at the extortion of money from Genoa, Beaulieu got wind of their approach and feared that it was from that direction that his armies were to be attacked, perhaps through the Turquino and Borghetta passes. He sent a quarter of his main force under Generals Sebotendorf and Pittoni west along the Riviera to check the French approach, which was effective but depleted Beaulieu's forces north of the Alps, where they were blocking any attempted approach by the French along the river valley of the Bormida River towards Milan. The French force, commanded by General Cervoni, held the Austrians in check at Voltri, and although suffering significant losses, did not need to pull back towards Savona, since the Austrians did not bother to follow up their victory. Meanwhile, Beaulieu had ordered his remaining forces north of the mountains, who, under the command of General Argenteau, were guarding the mountain passes around Dego, to advance up the river valley of the Bormida, to occupy positions in the Apennines north of Savona, with the intention of descending to Savona and crushing General Massena's force there. Beaulieu, who thought he was going to pin the French to the Riviera by a pincer movement and crush them, was about to be shocked out of his complacency. With a quarter of the Austrian main force tied down at Voltri by Cervoni, Napoleon saw his opportunity and immediately struck. He directed his forces up through the broken country north of Savona, preparing to attack the now weakened centre of Beaulieu's army north of the mountains, where they had concentrated themselves on a ridge or plateau above the village of Montenotte, waiting to descend upon Savona. Argenteau's problem? He had 9,000 troops with him, but they were spread out across 20 miles from Dego to Acqui, and while he had another 6,000 available in reserve, they were 20 miles away from him at Alexandria. Nonetheless, Argenteau tried to follow his orders to descend upon Savona, thinking he had the upper hand against the French waiting idly on the coast. So he sent a column of 3,700 men, Hungarians and Croatians, through a mountain pass in the direction of Savona until they reached an old Austrian redoubt on Monte Nagino, which overlooked the road to Savona, and which the Austrians must capture if they were to descend to the sea. What happened next decided the Battle of Montenotte. Instead of crumbling, and despite multiple vicious onslaughts which killed most of the Austrian officers, a small French detachment under Colonel Fournesset, subsequently joined by Colonel Rampont, who took overall command, held on stubbornly in the redoubt. They would not allow the Austrians to pass. The story goes that at one particularly perilous point, when all seemed lost for the French, Rampont demanded that his men swear an oath to conquer or die, and this heroic or foolhardy incident is the subject of the famous painting of the Battle of Montenotte by René Théodore Berthon. With the sound of cannon fire thundering through the passes of the Apennines above Savona, the Austrians now realized their potentially fatal mistake. The French were on the move through the mountains to counterattack Argenteau. A quarter of Austria's 30,000 men were now sitting idly by the seaside, separated from Argenteau's forces by the mountains, with no chance of quickly rejoining them, the closest route being via Acqui, and the French had now pinned down Argenteau's inadequate attacking force at Monte Nagino. What would Napoleon do next? It did not take long for Argenteau to find out, to his horror. Napoleon ordered General La Harpe's force to reinforce Rampont at the Monte Nagino redoubt, making a combined force of 7,000 men, who then attacked the shocked and outnumbered Argenteau on Mount Pras. Meanwhile, Napoleon ordered Generals Massena and Angerot to proceed from Savona through the Cardabona Pass to Caccare, to outflank on the Austrian right Argenteau's bogged-down forces. This rapid and aggressive turning movement by Massena and Angerot effectively severed the tenuous physical connection that previously existed between the Austrians and their erstwhile and uneasy allies the Sardinians, who, under General Colli, were a force of 21,000 men more committed to protecting the road to Turin and their own homeland than coming to the rescue of the hapless Argenteau. What made it worse was that Beaulieu had previously received secret intelligence from the Austrian government that the Sardinians were suspected of wanting to retire from their part in the broader alliance with Austria, referred to as the First Coalition. As a result, Beaulieu had not shared his plans of attack with General Colli, commander of the Sardinians, even though they were close personal friends. At this point, Napoleon had essentially achieved the purpose of his manoeuvres, to split the two armies so he could finish them off one by one. In any event, while the Austrians would continue to stiffly carry on the fight in the coming months, the Sardinians knew the game was up, and Napoleon was eventually able to wangle from them a very favourable ceasefire, which the Directory would eventually negotiate into a peace treaty. This effectively took the Sardinians out of the war and allowed the army of Italy to not only occupy key strategic forts and redoubts in Piedmont and Cuneo, Ceva, Alessandria and Tortona, but to claim Nice and Savoy as their own possessions. Further, the French could now replenish their supplies and coffers at the expense of the King of Sardinia, Amadeus III, and cross and crisscross his territories at will, to carry on the fight with Austria. As to the Austrians, Napoleon's brilliant manoeuvres had taken them completely by surprise, and being left numerically overwhelmed and fearful that they would be trapped in a pincer movement between La Harpe on their left and Massena and Angerot on their right, Argenteau made a fighting retreat up the valley of the Bormida River to the towns of Dego and Acqui, so as to regroup, recover, and to try to continue to protect the approaches to Milan. Argenteau's report to his commanding officer, Beaulieu: "I have to report, sir, that my command is almost completely destroyed." The Battle of Montenotte had been won. Meanwhile, Napoleon exploited his command of Piedmont and further separated the Sardinians from the Austrians by pushing his forces west towards Millesimo and east towards Dego, two towns whose names would be made famous by Napoleon's next battles in the First Italian campaign, and of which we shall hear much in a later episode in this series. In 1813, when the Montenotte medal was struck, Napoleon's empire had not yet collapsed, but the failure of Napoleon's Russian campaign was to be the beginning of its end. This no doubt placed Denon in a devilishly difficult position, as it would any propagandist who, having previously helped build up his leader in the public's mind into an invincible, almost godlike entity, now had to somehow explain to his audience why their erstwhile conquering hero's goals were being frustrated, and why his armies were being defeated, and Frenchmen as a whole humiliated. Denon cleverly approached the problem from two different angles. First, instead of shying away from Napoleon's defeat in Russia, Denon addressed it head-on so there would be no doubts. He provided the public with the obvious and most rational excuse, if an appeal to the supernatural can be described as rational. Denon's propagandistic reasoning is illustrated by the medal we see here, the retreat from Russia. According to Denon's narrative, there was no defeat. Napoleon's forces had simply been driven back by circumstances beyond Napoleon's control. Notice the title of the medal, Retraite de l'armée, retreat of the army, not defeat and Napoleon, but retreat and the army. The gods had conspired against Napoleon's forces in the form of nature, a well-understood and accepted trope from classical literature and art, which provided Denon with so much of the iconography used in his medals. In the retreat medal, Boreas, the Greek god of the north wind, is squeezing the cold winds of the Hyperborean region from his animal skin bag to drive Napoleon's forces, the Grande Armée, in the form of the Greek hero Heracles away. Fortunately, Heracles can count upon the protection of his cloak, made from the skin of the Nemean lion, which he strangled with his own bare hands to complete the first of his 12 labours. To those Frenchmen and women steeped in classical literature, it was easily accepted, almost in a subconscious way, that even the demigod Heracles, son of Zeus, and the mortal woman Alcmene, was no match for the overwhelming power of the gods, even if he was more quick-witted, powerful, and resourceful than any mortal man. Who could argue with that? Notice there's not a Russian in sight on the medal. They had, in Denon's narrative, nothing to do with it. It was purely a matter between Heracles and the fickle masters of all mortal men, the gods. And as if to illustrate the mercurial nature of the gods, and the sometimes wanton futility of their actions, Denon directed Gall, the engraver of the reverse of this medal, to place a dead horse in a prominent position directly beneath Boreas, the horse being intimately associated with the Anemoi, the wind gods, of which Boreas was a member. The Anemoi were not only often depicted as horses in the stable of Aeolus, the god to which the Anemoi was subordinate, but Boreas himself, after changing into the form of a stallion, had fathered 12 colts with the mares owned by the king of Dardania. See here, Denon is saying, how the gods have not only stymied and frustrated Napoleon, they have thoughtlessly damaged themselves. By implication, and by eliding two apparently unrelated concepts through the magical medium of propaganda, the Russians could also be seen to have done a silly thing by opposing Napoleon. It is at this point that we can now truly appreciate the historical context of the Battle of Montenotte medal, and Denon's purpose in executing it all those years later, in 1813. Previously only a minor battle in Napoleon's early career, Montenotte now took on a momentous significance because it provided Denon with the seed of a propaganda message he needed to help him approach the problem of Napoleon's uncharacteristic defeat in Russia. In the Retreat from Russia medal of November 1812, Denon had set the scene for his argument by explaining to the French public that Napoleon was not responsible for the lack of victory in Russia and the immense loss of men, materiel, and national prestige. The fickleness of nature was to blame. Now Denon approached it from the other angle. He had to find a reason for the public to continue to have faith in Napoleon. He had to inspire them to believe again that despite all the odds against him, despite the crushing disappointment, that their emperor could indeed work miracles, just like Heracles. Denon's answer to the dilemma? Remember Montenotte. Remember when our army of Italy was languishing on the Riviera, bombarded from the sea by the British, harassed from the mountains by the Austrians and the Sardinians. In stepped our emperor, just a mere stripling, aged 26 years at the time, and with a ragged and starving bunch of Frenchmen, and against all odds of success, faced down the overwhelming might of the cruel, repressive, autocratic Habsburg Empire and its brilliantly arrayed regiments, and he crushed them like so many insects in the palm of his hand. Then, too, the French had little hope of success, having been repulsed by the enemy time and again. Then, too, all seemed grim and desolate. But Napoleon had faith in himself and in his God-given military skills. Victory has always had a place in her heart for our emperor. What the gods take away one day, Denon tells the French, the goddess Victory will give back the next, especially to those born, as was Napoleon, under a special star of destiny. In 1796, Napoleon had confronted his discontented and despondent men and had demanded of them, "Soldiers of the army of Italy, will you lack courage?" Now, in 1813, after the defeat in Russia, Denon was demanding of the French people, "Citizens of France, will you lack courage?"